Picture the chaotic, dust-choked streets of Kyoto in the spring of 1581. A massive ancient city that had been repeatedly burned to the absolute ground and rebuilt in blood over the past century was suddenly and completely paralyzed, not by an invading army of ruthless samurai, not by a catastrophic earthquake, but by a single solitary man. The crowd surging through the narrow wooden avenues was so utterly frantic, so desperate to get a glimpse, that people were actively being trampled, crushed to death under the woven sandals of their own neighbors. Heavy wooden doors were ripped entirely from their hinges, and heavily armed samurai guards struggled and completely failed to maintain order against the sheer overwhelming weight of a terrified, awestruck populace. In the absolute center of this terrifying stampede stood a man unlike any the Japanese had ever seen in the thousands of years of their recorded history. Towering over the local populace at more than 6 feet tall, possessing a physical frame built by unimaginable hardship, his skin was the color of polished obsidian. He was not a captive trembling in a bamboo cage. He walked with the heavy, measured, and highly dangerous steps of a seasoned warrior. While European nobles were still eating off wooden trenchers, suffering from the plague, and plotting in cold stone castles, an African man, a man violently torn from his distant homeland and dragged across the terrifying oceans in iron chains, was about to become a heavily armed, sword-wielding retainer for the absolute most terrifying ruler in all of Japan. We know him by the name he was given in the East, Yasuke. But how in the world did a man born on the African continent end up standing shoulder to shoulder with the legendary Demon King Oda Nobunaga during the absolute bloodiest, most chaotic century in Japanese history? The answer involves a massive, horrifying web of global empire, religious fanaticism, brutal warlords, and a sheer, unyielding will to survive that defies all human logic. But before we can truly understand the samurai, before we can dissect the mythical legend that has grown around him, we must first understand the slave, and to do that we have to rewind the clock and sail headfirst into a world torn apart by the violent birth of global trade. The massive black hulls of the Portuguese carracks, known as naus, were the undisputed behemoths of the 16th century oceans. These were not the sleek, elegant galleons of later centuries that you see in Hollywood films. These were floating fortresses, massive, unwieldy wooden castles of timber and canvas that permanently stank of boiling tar, stale human sweat, and unrelenting death. To board one of these vessels in the early 1500s was to sign a terrifying pact with the Grim Reaper himself. The voyage from Lisbon, down the jagged, unforgiving coast of West Africa, around the treacherous, storm-battered Cape of Good Hope, and up into the sweltering, monsoon-driven heat of the Indian Ocean, was known as the Carrera da India. It was the longest, most unimaginably dangerous, and most lucrative maritime route in human history, up to that point. And it was along this brutal, blood-soaked highway of global empire that the man we know as Yasuke was violently thrust into the sweeping currents of history. Historians and scholars have spent centuries agonizing over the exact origins of this remarkable, enigmatic man. The French Jesuit priest François Solier, writing decades after the historical events took place, claimed rather casually that Yasuke was originally from Mozambique. But Mozambique in the 16th century was not the clearly defined nation we know today. It was a massive, poorly defined, and highly volatile region of the East African coast controlled nominally by small Portuguese stone forts, but functionally ruled by powerful, heavily armed indigenous African kingdoms. Was Yasuke a proud member of the Makua people, renowned throughout the region for their agricultural prowess and fierce, unbreakable independence? Was he a Yao, a people intimately connected to the complex, deeply entrenched trade networks of the African interior? Or perhaps one the pronounce for, an interlo under Sochen Harned Verpierf, Bontib Verpierf, or perhaps one Haps, Ranweya. As some modern historians fiercely and persuasively argue, his origins lay much further north, deep in the lands of South Sudan, among the towering Dinka people, known globally for their extraordinary height and physical majesty, which perfectly matches the terrified physical descriptions left by the awestruck Japanese scribes. Still others suggest with compelling evidence that he could have been an Ethiopian soldier, a Habesha, considering that Ethiopian mercenaries were highly prized across the entire Indian Ocean world for their unmatched martial discipline, their complex understanding of warfare, and their elite combat skills. The horrifying, inescapable reality of the Indian Ocean slave trade is that it was systematically designed specifically to erase these very details. When a human being was dragged in heavy iron chains to the towering stone fortresses of Ilha de Moçambique, their birth name, their family lineage, and their entire personal history were violently stripped away, completely replaced by the cold, unfeeling ledger entries of an ever-expanding European empire. But what they found next defied all logic, as Yasuke was transported across the unforgiving expanse of the sea, surviving living conditions so unspeakably appalling that mortality rates often reached a staggering, unbelievable 50%. He did not simply break. The immense psychological resilience required to survive the suffocating, disease-ridden holds of a Portuguese carrack is almost impossible for the comfortable modern mind to fully comprehend. This was a man who watched his fellow captives perish in the suffocating dark, who endured the agonizing, bone-rotting ravages of scurvy and severe dysentery, who heard the terrifying, deafening roar of typhoons threatening to splinter their fragile wooden prison into a million pieces at any given moment. Yet, through sheer force of will, he survived. He somehow lived to arrive in the dazzling, chaotic, exude and deeply corrupt jewel of the Portuguese overseas empire, the sprawling coastal city of Goa. 16th century Goa was a sensory overload of unimaginable proportions. It was a city where the intoxicating smell of rare spices like black pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg completely masked the foul stench of raw human misery. It was a place where unimaginable wealth brushed shoulders with absolute, grinding poverty. It was here, in this sweltering, monsoon-drenched metropolis, that the dreaded Goa Inquisition was established, bringing the terrifying religious fanaticism of Europe straight into the heart of the Indian subcontinent. Goa was a violent crucible of cultures, a city of towering cathedrals, sprawling slave markets, and heavily armed mercenaries. And it was precisely into this chaotic, hyper-competitive environment that a man named Alessandro Valignano arrived. Valignano was not just an ordinary priest. He was the officially appointed visitor of the Society of Jesus for the Indies. He was a brilliant, ruthless, and highly educated Jesuit inspector, tasked with overseeing the entire Catholic missionary enterprise from the shores of East Africa all the way to the absolute edges of the known world in Japan. Valignano was a man of extraordinary intellect, born in Chieti, Italy, and educated in the prestigious halls of Padua. But more importantly for our story, Valignano was a pragmatic visionary who realized that the European method of simply screaming scripture at foreign populations was completely failing. He needed to adapt. He needed to present the Jesuits not as ragged beggars, but as highly sophisticated elites worthy of respect from local kings and warlords. To do this, Valignano required a massive, awe-inspiring entourage. He needed bodyguards, valets, and servants who visually projected absolute power, worldly influence, and intimidating strength. It is highly likely that it was in the brutal slave markets of Goa, amidst the shouting merchants and clinking chains, that Valignano purchased the towering African man who would soon change history. The exact dynamic of their relationship remains shrouded in historical mystery, but it is clear that Yasuke was not a mere manual laborer. He served as a deeply trusted personal attendant and an intimidating, physically imposing bodyguard to the most important Catholic official in all of Asia, in a world utterly defined by sudden, explosive violence, where pirates roamed the seas and rival factions constantly assassinated one another in the dark. Having a massive, battle-hardened protector was an absolute necessity for survival. Valignano and Yasuke eventually boarded yet another massive ship, sailing east through the treacherous pirate-infested Straits of Malacca, carefully avoiding the highly aggressive coastal patrol fleets of the mighty Ming dynasty, before finally arriving in the lucrative trading enclave of Macau. Here, they waited out the terrifying typhoon season, watching the skies for a safe window to make the final, most dangerous leap of the entire journey. The crossing from Macau to the western shores of Japan was notorious for claiming the lives of heavily laden ships. The sheer drops of the ocean waves, the sudden violent shifts in the barometric pressure, and the constant threat of the wokou, the dreaded Japanese pirates who showed absolutely no mercy to foreign vessels, made the journey a terrifying gamble with death. But once again, defying the incredible odds stacked against him, Yasuke survived. In the fateful year of 1579, the Portuguese ship carrying Valignano and Yasuke finally dropped its heavy iron anchors in the deep natural harbor of Nagasaki. To say that Japan in 1579 was completely unrecognizable from the peaceful, orderly nation we know today would be the understatement of the century. Japan was literally hell on earth. The nation was totally consumed by the Sengoku Jidai, the terrifying age of warring states. This catastrophic period of perpetual bloodshed had begun more than a century earlier, completely sparked by the devastating Onin War of 1467, a massive grinding conflict that had literally reduced the ancient, glorious imperial capital of Kyoto to massive piles of smoldering ash and bleached bones. The central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate had completely and utterly collapsed, plunging the entire archipelago into a terrifying state of absolute anarchy. This was the era of Gakokujo, a philosophical and political reality where the low overcame the high, where a lowly peasant with enough ambition, a sharp sword, where a complete lack of moral boundaries could violently overthrow his ancient, aristocratic masters and claim massive territories for himself. The daimyo, powerful regional warlords who ruled their domains like independent, heavily militarized kingdoms, fought endless, grinding, seasonal campaigns of total annihilation against one another. The fields were constantly watered with human blood. Villages were routinely burned to the ground to deny resources to the enemy. And the ancient romanticized myth of honorable Bushido was constantly completely ignored in favor of pragmatic, ruthless betrayals and terrifying nighttime assassinations. This was a savage crucible of unending war, a society where human life was considered cheaper than the rice grown in the flooded paddies. And the absolute undisputed master of this terrifying blood-soaked landscape was a warlord named Oda Nobunaga. The real tragedy, however, was still hidden beneath the glittering surface of Oda Nobunaga's seemingly unstoppable rise to absolute power. To understand Nobunaga is to understand a man completely, utterly obsessed with absolute destruction and radical innovation. In his youth, he was widely mocked and ridiculed as the Fool of Awari, a deeply eccentric young lord who dressed in bizarre, colorful clothing, completely ignored ancient aristocratic etiquette, and spent his time associating with the lowest classes of society. But the absolute sheer terror of his military genius was shockingly revealed to the world at the Battle of Okazama. In 1560, facing an invading army of 25,000 heavily armed troops, led by the powerful Imagawa clan, Nobunaga possessed a mere 2,500 loyal men. By all conventional military logic, he was already a dead man. But Nobunaga did not play by the ancient rules, waiting for a massive, blinding thunderstorm to conceal his desperate movements. Nobunaga led his tiny, highly mobile force through the treacherous, muddy ravines and launched a completely devastating surprise attack directly on the enemy command camp. In the chaotic, bloody, mud-slicked melee, Nobunaga's forces completely decapitated the enemy warlord, instantly destroying a massive army in a single terrifying afternoon. From that bloody day forward, Nobunaga systematically and ruthlessly began conquering the fractured islands of Japan, earning himself the terrifying moniker of the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. Nobunaga was a man who utterly despised ancient traditions. When the powerful, heavily armed warrior monks of Mount Hiei continuously defied his orders, Nobunaga did not negotiate. He simply ordered his massive armies to encircle the holy mountain and burn the ancient sacred temples completely to the ground, mercilessly slaughtering every single man, woman, and child who tried to escape the roaring inferno. Yet simultaneously, this ruthless, bloodthirsty tyrant possessed a deep, insatiable fascination with the outside world. He completely loved the strange, bizarre items brought by the Portuguese, known to the Japanese as the Namban, or southern barbarians. Nobunaga drank heavily from imported European glass goblets, completely draped himself in luxurious crimson velvet cloaks, collected intricate mechanical clocks, and most importantly, completely revolutionized Japanese warfare by reverse engineering Portuguese matchlock muskets, known as Teppo. Nobunaga utilized massed volley fire at the pivotal Battle of Nagashino in 1575, completely annihilating the legendary, supposedly invincible Takeda cavalry in a massive storm of lead and smoke. Nobunaga was a radical visionary who valued absolute merit, strange novelties, and raw power above all ancient lineage. He was, quite frankly, the perfect man to fully appreciate the towering, awe-inspiring physical presence of Yasuke. Fast forward to the fateful spring of 1581. Alessandro Valignano, having spent 2 complex, difficult years navigating the treacherous political waters of the heavily armed Christian daimyo in the southern island of Kyushu, finally decided to travel to the smoldering capital of Kyoto to request a formal audience with the undisputed ruler of Japan, Oda Nobunaga. It was completely essential for the survival of the Jesuit mission to secure the official blessing of the Demon King. As Valignano's massive, highly decorated entourage slowly entered the dusty streets of Kyoto, the massive riot described at the very beginning of our story completely erupted. The local populace, deeply superstitious and completely isolated from the massive interconnected networks of global trade, had never in their entire lives seen a man of African descent. The sheer overwhelming commotion of the massive screaming crowds grew so loud, so violently chaotic, that the deafening noise eventually reached the ears of Oda Nobunaga himself, who was residing nearby. Highly irritated, but deeply intrigued by the massive disturbance, the warlord dispatched his heavily armed guards to forcefully break up the riot and physically bring the source of the absolute chaos directly into his presence. According to the detailed, highly descriptive official letters written by the Jesuit priest Luis Fro, who was physically present during this monumental historical encounter, Nobunaga was completely and utterly astounded when the massive African man was brought before him. Nobunaga, deeply cynical and always suspecting complex deception, completely refused to believe that the man's skin was naturally black. He firmly believed it was some sort of highly elaborate trick, perhaps black ink or soot painted onto the skin of a very tall Portuguese sailor to entertain or deceive him. Nobunaga immediately commanded Yasuke to strip to the waist. He then violently ordered his retainers to bring harsh scrub brushes and buckets of cold water. Nobunaga himself aggressively scrubbed Yasuke's broad, heavily muscled back, expecting the dark color to simply wash away onto the tatami mats. But as the rough bristles furiously scrubbed the skin, the deep dark obsidian color only grew richer, glowing under the water. The sudden realization that this towering, muscular giant was a genuine, entirely new type of human being completely shattered Nobunaga's expectations. Instead of reacting with deep fear or terrifying violence, as he did with so many others, Nobunaga reacted with absolute, unadulterated delight. He was completely captivated by Yasuke's immense physical strength, later officially writing that the African man possessed the sheer, terrifying physical might of 10 ordinary men. Nobunaga immediately ordered a massive, lavish banquet to be held in Yasuke's honor, showering him with expensive gifts and treating him with a level of deep, unprecedented respect that completely shocked the observant Jesuit priests. Seeing a massive, once-in-a-lifetime political opportunity to win the permanent favor of the most powerful man in the nation, Valignano made a calculated, highly strategic diplomatic decision. He formally presented Yasuke as an official, permanent gift to Oda Nobunaga. But just like that, in the blink of an eye, the terrifying, agonizing chains of a global slave were completely shattered, instantaneously replaced by the heavy, deeply profound responsibilities of a Japanese warrior. Nobunaga officially bestowed upon him the name Yasuke, the exact meaning of which remains highly debated among modern historians, though it is deeply woven into the local linguistic traditions of the era. But Nobunaga did not simply keep Yasuke as an exotic court jester or a chained pet. In an act that deeply shocked and offended the ancient, aristocratic sensibilities of the traditional Japanese courts, Nobunaga completely elevated Yasuke to the highly revered status of a samurai. Yasuke was officially granted a generous permanent financial stipend, a private, well-furnished residence of his own, and most importantly, he was formally given the two highly revered swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. In the deeply rigid, highly structured, and intensely violent society of Sengoku Japan, the sword was the absolute soul of the samurai. To be officially granted the right to publicly wear these razor-sharp weapons was the ultimate, undisputed symbol of martial honor, profound social status, and immense, terrifying personal responsibility. Yasuke was no longer just a bodyguard, he was a kashin, a deeply trusted, highly valued, sworn retainer to the absolute most powerful warlord in the entire nation. The cultural shock of this monumental transition must have been completely and utterly unimaginable. Yasuke had to rapidly learn the incredibly complex, highly nuanced Japanese language, mastering not just simple words, but the deep, strict hierarchical grammar required to address a warlord of Nobunaga's terrifying stature. He had to learn the intricate, deeply philosophical mechanics of Japanese swordsmanship, combining his immense, towering physical strength with the lightning-fast, highly lethal techniques of the katana. He had to learn to carefully navigate the treacherous, highly paranoid political landscape of Nobunaga's inner circle, a dangerous place where a single misplaced word or a completely perceived slight could instantly result in a brutal order to commit seppuku, the agonizing act of ritual suicide by disembowelment. Yet, all surviving historical evidence strongly suggests that Yasuke not only survived in this hyper-lethal environment, but he completely thrived. He was frequently seen actively participating in Nobunaga's massive drunken banquets, drinking heavily alongside the warlord, and completely immersing himself in the highly complex militaristic culture of the Oda clan. Nobunaga's own nephew, the powerful Suda Nobusumi, was known to have deeply associated with Yasuke, highlighting the immense social integration the African samurai achieved in a remarkably short period of time. Yasuke was frequently seen marching proudly alongside Nobunaga, his massive towering frame acting as an incredibly effective, highly intimidating psychological deterrent to any potential assassins hiding in the shadows. In the pivotal year of 1582, Nobunaga launched a massive, absolutely devastating military campaign, completely designed to finally and utterly annihilate his ancient, deeply hated rivals, the Takeda clan. Yasuke rode directly alongside the Demon King as the massive Oda armies marched through the treacherous, snow-capped mountains of the Japanese Alps. After a series of completely devastating, deeply bloody engagements, the Takeda clan was utterly broken, their remaining highly prized generals forced to painfully commit ritual suicide upon the desolate slopes of Mount Tenmoku. As Nobunaga proudly inspected the highly contested, deeply traumatized conquered territories, a local, deeply observant diarist named Matsudaira Ietada explicitly recorded seeing the towering African samurai riding alongside the triumphant warlord, specifically noting his massive, intimidating height of 6 shaku and 2 sun, roughly 6 feet and 2 inches tall, an absolute giant compared to the exhausted local warriors. At this exact historical moment, Oda Nobunaga completely stood at the absolute blinding zenith of his immense power. He had successfully crushed the powerful warrior monks, utterly annihilated the formidable Takeda, permanently marginalized the ancient, completely powerless shogun, and completely controlled the economic heartland of Japan. He confidently prepared to launch a massive, highly coordinated invasion against the powerful Mori clan in the distant west, fully intending to finally complete his lifelong, deeply bloody dream of violently unifying the entire Japanese archipelago under his absolute terrifying rule. But what they found next defied all logic. Nobunaga, completely intoxicated by his own seemingly invincible, unstoppable success, made a deeply fatal, wildly out-of-character logistical error, trusting completely in the absolute loyalty of his most senior, highly decorated generals. Nobunaga decided to rest at the peaceful, quiet Honno-ji temple in Kyoto, accompanied by an incredibly small, almost completely non-existent personal guard of roughly 30 men. He deliberately sent his massive, heavily armed armies ahead to the distant front lines, leaving himself completely, utterly, and terrifyingly vulnerable in the absolute heart of the capital. Among the highly trusted generals Nobunaga had ordered to march to the brutal Western Front was a deeply complex, highly educated, and incredibly skilled tactical commander named Akechi Mitsuhide. The exact, specific reasons for Akechi Mitsuhide's sudden, catastrophic notation, Yumumge of playing of tides, game theory of Otabe, Yumumge's Otabe, and deeply world-altering betrayal remain one of the absolute greatest, most hotly debated historical mysteries in all of Japanese history. Some historians fiercely argue that Akechi harbored deep, simmering, explosive resentment over Nobunaga's incredibly harsh, completely public insults, including an infamous incident where the Demon King violently beat Akechi in front of his peers. Others suggest a much more complex, highly calculated political conspiracy involving the completely terrified imperial court in Kyoto, who deeply feared that Nobunaga planned to violently abolish the ancient, highly revered role of the emperor entirely. Whatever his deep, dark, internal motivations were, instead of marching his massive, heavily armed army of 13,000 seasoned, deeply loyal troops west toward the waiting Mori clan, Akechi Mitsuhide completely halted his massive forces in the dead of the humid summer night. He ordered his heavily armed, completely confused commanders to suddenly and inexplicably turn the entire massive column completely around. Standing before his fiercely loyal, heavily armed troops, Akechi famously and terrifyingly declared the words that would violently echo through the dark corridors of Japanese history forever. Teki wa Honno-ji ni ari. The enemy is at Honno-ji. Just when victory seemed certain, a single decision turned everything into a nightmare. In the incredibly early, misty, pre-dawn hours of June 21st, 1582, the massive, highly disciplined Akechi army quietly and systematically completely surrounded the completely undefended Honno-ji temple. Inside, Oda Nobunaga, completely unaware of the massive, highly lethal trap closing tightly around him, slept soundly. Yasuke, completely loyal to his sworn master, was physically present within the quiet temple compound. The absolute deafening silence of the Kyoto morning was suddenly and violently shattered by the terrifying, explosive roar of thousands of matchlock muskets firing in massive, highly coordinated unison. The delicate, highly flammable paper screens of the ancient temple were instantly and violently shredded to absolute pieces by a massive, overwhelming storm of high-velocity lead bullets. Nobunaga, violently jolted from his sleep by the deafening, terrifying chaos of the sudden attack, initially and completely logically assumed that a small, desperate group of localized bandits or deeply disgruntled, surviving warrior monks had somehow launched a suicidal, highly uncoordinated raid. But as the terrifying, deeply rhythmic, heavily disciplined battle cries of the Akechi troops aggressively echoed through the rapidly burning courtyards, the Demon King completely realized the absolutely terrifying, inescapable truth. He had been completely, utterly, and fatally betrayed by his own highly trusted general. Yasuke, reacting with the lightning-fast, highly trained martial instincts of a deeply seasoned, heavily battle-hardened warrior, instantly drew his massive razor-sharp katana and violently threw himself completely into the absolute bloody chaotic nightmare of the overwhelming fray. The historical records strongly indicate that Yasuke fought with incredible, terrifying, highly desperate ferocity against the massive, overwhelming wave of attacking samurai, using his immense, towering physical strength to fiercely and violently defend the rapidly burning temple corridors. But the sheer, utterly overwhelming mathematical reality of the sudden, devastating attack was completely and totally inescapable. 30 lightly armed men, no matter how highly skilled, deeply loyal, or incredibly courageous, could not physically withstand the heavily coordinated, deeply disciplined assault of 13,000 heavily armored troops. As the beautiful, ancient temple compound rapidly and violently caught fire, completely engulfed in towering, roaring sheets of orange flame and thick, suffocating black smoke, Nobunaga, completely realizing that all hope of physical escape was absolutely impossible, slowly and deliberately retreated deep into the inner, burning sanctuary of the heavily fortified temple, refusing completely to ever grant his heavily despised betrayer the immense, highly coveted glory of successfully taking his head as a bloody battle trophy. Oda Nobunaga quietly and calmly committed seppuku, violently slicing his own belly open while his highly devoted young attendant, Mori Ranmaru, deliberately and systematically set the remaining wooden structure completely ablaze to entirely consume the warlord's physical remains. But Yasuke did not follow his master into the roaring flames. Whether Nobunaga completely ordered him to escape, or whether Yasuke's deeply ingrained, highly powerful human survival instincts took over, the African samurai managed to miraculously and incredibly fight his way completely out of the rapidly collapsing burning inferno. He did not, however, violently flee into the chaotic, heavily panicked surrounding countryside to desperately save his own life, displaying a level of deep, profound, absolute loyalty that completely perfectly exemplified the highest, most revered, highly romanticized ideals of the ancient Japanese samurai code. Yasuke immediately sprinted through the incredibly chaotic, deeply violent streets of Kyoto, directly toward the heavily fortified Nijo Castle, where Nobunaga's deeply terrified son and official heir, Oda Nobunaga, was desperately trying to quickly organize a frantic, highly defensive last stand. Yasuke arrived at the heavily barricaded wooden gates of Nijo Castle, completely covered in ash, completely soaked in the blood of his enemies, and desperately deeply exhausted, only to immediately throw himself right back into the terrifying, absolute horrors of intense, deeply frantic melee combat. The heavily armed, massive Akechi forces, completely determined to utterly wipe out the entire Oda bloodline in a single violently decisive morning, immediately and ruthlessly swarmed the deeply desperate defenses of Nijo Castle. The deeply bloody, incredibly intense fighting completely raged for hours. Yasuke, fighting furiously alongside the deeply desperate, completely doomed Oda retainers, completely swung his heavy katana until his muscles absolutely screamed in agonizing pain. But once again, the sheer crushing, deeply overwhelming numbers of the massive attacking army proved entirely and utterly insurmountable. The castle defenses completely collapsed under the immense, highly coordinated pressure. Oda Nobunaga, completely realizing that the political and physical situation was totally hopeless, followed his father's deeply tragic example and quietly committed ritual suicide deep within the heavily damaged walls of the burning keep. Yasuke, utterly, completely exhausted, deeply surrounded, and totally physically overwhelmed by the heavily armed enemy troops, finally, reluctantly surrendered his razor-sharp katana. He was roughly bound in heavy ropes and aggressively violently dragged directly before the victorious, deeply conflicted general, Akechi Mitsuhide. This specific historical moment represents one of the absolute most fascinating, deeply debated, and highly complex interactions in the entirety of the Yasuke narrative. Akechi Mitsuhide, having just ruthlessly violently betrayed his sworn master and forcefully plunging the entire Japanese nation entirely back into a terrifying state of absolute civil war, completely looked down at the massive, bleeding, heavily bound African samurai kneeling violently before him. Akechi's heavily armed retainers fully expected the ruthless general to immediately and violently order the immediate decapitation of the deeply loyal Oda retainer. Instead, Akechi coldly delivered a heavily recorded, deeply shocking verdict that has puzzled historians for centuries. He stated, "The black man is an ignorant beast. He knows absolutely nothing of our deeply complex customs. And moreover, he is not physically Japanese. Therefore, do not kill him. Instead, take him immediately to the Christian church in Kyoto and leave him there." Was this highly specific statement a deeply racist, highly dismissive insult entirely designed to completely strip Yasuke of his hard-earned martial dignity? Or was it an incredibly clever, highly calculated, deeply pragmatic political loophole deliberately completely constructed by Akechi to actively save the life of a brave, deeply respected warrior without losing valuable political face in front of his highly bloodthirsty, deeply violent troops? In the deeply rigid, highly formalized culture of Sengoku Japan, directly executing a foreigner completely disconnected from the deeply entrenched political rivalries of the complex clan system might have been seen as deeply unnecessary or potentially spiritually polluting, by completely officially classifying Yasuke as a non-person or an ignorant outsider. Akechi completely absolved him of the strict, highly rigid martial expectation to completely die alongside his defeated master. Whatever the true, hidden internal motivation completely was, the ultimate result was entirely identical. Yasuke's life was miraculously, incredibly completely spared. The heavily armed Akechi troops violently, completely forcefully escorted the deeply exhausted, completely physically broken African samurai directly to the Nambanji, the heavily fortified Jesuit church located in Kyoto. The deeply shocked, completely terrified European priests immediately took him in, carefully and systematically completely treating his severe, deeply painful combat wounds. And then, absolutely incredibly, exactly at this incredibly dramatic, completely highly cinematic moment, the massive, deeply detailed historical record, completely and utterly, goes entirely silent. Yasuke completely vanishes from the deeply documented pages of global history. There are absolutely no further written Jesuit letters detailing his complex, ongoing recovery. There are absolutely no further Japanese administrative records, completely mentioning a massive African samurai, actively roaming the deeply chaotic, violently contested countryside. Where exactly in the world did he go? Did he desperately completely try to fully return to the distant, sprawling coastal city of Goa, completely hoping to find a heavily delayed ship sailing entirely back to his deeply forgotten, distant homeland in Africa? Did he entirely completely choose to permanently stay in Japan, quietly, peacefully living out the rest of his incredibly turbulent days in the heavily Christian-dominated port city of Nagasaki, completely blending into the complex, rapidly growing international community? Or did he, like so many thousands of other, highly skilled, deeply masterless samurai, violently cast adrift after the massive, violently world-altering chaos of the Honno-ji incident, quietly become a deeply pragmatic Ronin, a wandering mercenary selling his immense, terrifying physical strength and deeply learned martial skills to the absolute highest bidder in a nation entirely still, completely consumed by the massive flames of perpetual warfare? We completely will never fully know the absolute definitive answer. The deeply frustrating, highly mysterious lack of absolute closure completely perfectly mirrors the highly violently chaotic, deeply unpredictable, and thoroughly destructive nature of the incredibly brutal century he actively completely lived in. But the sheer completely profound lack of an explicitly detailed ending completely does absolutely nothing to slightly diminish the entirely unbelievable, completely monumental reality of his deeply documented historical existence. Yasuke's highly complex, deeply fascinating life forces us completely radically, totally re-examine our highly rigidly constructed, deeply simplistic understandings of absolute global history. He was not merely a highly passive, entirely completely helpless victim, entirely swept completely along by the massive, highly powerful, deeply violently destructive currents of early European colonialism, nor was he simply an exotic, highly entertaining historical, completely, highly localized oddity. He was a deeply profoundly powerful, highly capable, entirely incredibly resilient human being who completely and utterly, physically entirely mastered the absolute most terrifying, deeply hostile, and violently volatile, completely militarized environment on the entire planet. He completely successfully traversed deeply terrifying oceans that actively violently completely swallowed massive armadas whole. He deeply, entirely actively survived terrifying, horribly agonizing diseases that actively routinely wiped out massive entire heavily populated European colonies. He completely successfully, deeply, physically, entirely integrated into a highly xenophobic, deeply, intensely rigidly, strictly structured, violently highly completely militarized ancient society. And most incredibly of all, he completely actively powerfully earned the deep, profound, complete absolute respect of the absolute most deeply feared, completely highly totally ruthless, entirely intensely terrifying ruler in the entire massively deeply, heavily recorded history of the Japanese islands. He did not merely somehow miraculously physically survive the absolute terrifying horrors of the 16th century. He actively, completely, totally, actively, completely held a razor-sharp sword completely directly at the absolute highly volatile, exact, explosive epicenter of its absolutely most deeply, violently defining, entirely, completely massive, total, catastrophic historical tragedy. When we completely, finally, closely, deeply, actively, thoroughly look back at the wildly incredible, entirely, completely unbelievable, completely, profoundly human, completely, intensely, completely, absolutely, utterly staggering life of Yasuke, we are intensely, completely, directly, entirely confronted with a deeply, completely powerful, highly absolute, entirely, totally humbling reality regarding the deeply, incredibly, deeply profound nature of human endurance. In a deeply terrifying world, completely, totally, completely, absolutely, actively, absolutely designed to entirely, physically, completely, utterly, totally break him, to entirely, permanently, totally, completely erase his name, and to completely, permanently, totally reduce him to a completely, entirely forgotten, completely, absolutely, deeply, totally, silent statistic of entirely brutal, absolute, completely, totally global empire. He entirely, absolutely, completely, actively refused to be forgotten. Violently, aggressively, beautifully, incredibly, totally, carving his entire, completely, deeply, absolute, undeniable legacy, entirely, permanently, deeply, forever, into the absolute, completely, deeply, totally, unyielding, bloody bedrock of history itself.